festival since there. So thank you for always being part of the Kolkata Literary Meet whenever you have a new book.
Thank you so much, Mala. I was just being asked by a journalist before this session, what does it feel like coming to KLM? And I said, look, it feels like home, because I've always been here for the literary meet. I'm from Kolkata, and the Victoria Memorial at the back is perhaps the most familiar sight to a Kolkatan. So it feels lovely to be here.
Thank you. So let's dive straight into the session and about the book. It's very different from Sarojini's Mother, which was your last book. And we've discussed this before off stage. It comes, there's a line at the back, on the back blurb, which says, this is what is happening to our country. We are becoming unrecognizable to each other. So would you say that this book, and hello Raghu, I've not even turned left. So thank you for being part of this session.
My pleasure.
Yes. So we both will, on occasion, Raghu too, you're free to ask him questions whenever you think you need to ask him something. So we had discussed that this comes from a position of anguish at what is happening around you, the news headlines, the Twitter pictures, the way television news appears every evening. So is this from a point of worry and anguish that you've written this novel?
Certainly came out of a place of anguish. You know, the last 2 years have been difficult for all of us on account of the pandemic. And I think the last 2 years have also been difficult because of the outpouring of hate that we've seen in this country. I mean, there were all kinds of events that happened at rapid pace. The CAA, NRC, the Delhi riots, the lynchings, now the hijab controversy, and all of that. And it troubled me deeply because I'm from here. I was born and raised in this city. I was born and raised in this country. And certainly in our growing up years, there were differences of opinion. You know, politicians had different perspectives in terms of which way the direction the nation should take. There would be animated debates in Kolkata tea shops, but I don't think I have ever witnessed the outpouring of hate that we have seen in the last couple of years, and maybe a little bit more. And it has come from two contending perspectives about the vision of India. We have grown up with the vision that this country, according to its constitution, is a secular democratic nation. And obviously that's an aspiration. Our country was never fully democratic or fully secular. But that was the ideal that we inculcated growing up in this country. Now, the last few years, is a contending view, there's a contending ideal of India that is gaining center stage. And that ideal is that of the Hindu Rashtra. Now, the clash between these two ideals, which is my point of anguish, is not simply a partisanal clash. This is not simply a matter of BJP versus the INC, or the BJP versus the TMC in this state, or the AAP, or so on and so forth. This is a conflict which is ripping apart the soul of India. And we are becoming strangers to each other. We are becoming suspicious of each other's motives. You know, Mala, a few days back, a bunch of my Bengali friends, who are all senior doctors, said, we are going on a holiday together. And we have signed a pact before the holiday. And the pact is, we are not going to discuss politics. There are a bunch of Bengalis signing a pact that they're not going to discuss politics. Why is that? Because the clash between the two ideals has now infiltrated into our homes, into our families, among our friends, in our communities. Okay. And that is the point of anguish, that is the place of anguish which sort of led me to write this novel.
So let me throw that to you, because he talks about growing up in an India which was very different, which had certain aspirations, and though there were imperfections, the aspiration remained the same one. Now, the book is called In an Ideal World, and I'll come back to Kunal about that. So do you think the ideal India has changed, and the two views, the India you've grown up in, how is it different from the one he grew up in? I'm assuming you're still growing up.
Well, there's a lot of things that there's a lot of differences that are brought out by this fairly small, whatever the difference is between our ages and our generations and the places where we grew up, creates some fairly significant differences in what we've seen. Because I think for Kunal to have grown up in West Bengal in a particular generation means that there was an earlier iteration of political violence and an extra-constitutional kind of rebellion. There is also a point of reference in this book, which is what does it mean to be a left-wing extreme, to be a communist or a leftist, or to be motivated and to glamorize an extremist movement as happened in the past. And one of the things the family in this book has to reckon with is not just that the son has become a form of extremist, but that the father in the family, who is now a very comfortable and mild bank manager, has a form of extremism in his past as well. And, I didn't grow up either in the 70s nor in Bengal, so to me this is all very exotic because I just grew up in Bangalore in the 90s, which was as non-radical a place as you could get. All we did was get excited about going to KFC, and we were I grew up in a very neoliberal place in a neoliberal generation, so certainly one of the things that this book deals with and that requires some honesty is the fact that there is extremism in our past as well as in our present, and what we fear in our future. They have different ideologies. They have different shades, and for better or for worse, this country has ridden through a previous phase of extremism, and that may shine light on what's happening now. And I think Kunal will have to tell us about that. So this also reflects in the nature of the generational divide in this book, because in my life, I'm constantly meeting young people who, or I'm getting DMs from young people who say, "Hi Raghu," or "Hi sir, my parents watch too much Times now and they are becoming, and they are being like toxified. They watch too much toxic TV and they are becoming unbearable to live with because they're getting radicalized by this, this right-wing Hindu discourse." And so the question that I typically encounter is young people who can't bear that their parents are getting radicalized. Whereas in this book, this was an interesting difference. It's the parents who are discovering that their son has become a stranger to them and is becoming radicalized and is no longer part of their ideological family. And so these differences jumped out at me, and they're interesting, and they seem like they also reflect the relatively small difference in our own life experience.
So just taking up from where he left, you do bring out the politics of the 70s, and the book somehow manages to not exonerate anybody, and the corollary of that is you have, I'm sure, managed to offend everybody, which is a good space to be in as an author. So was that the desire to show Joy's political backstory and what was happening with Bobby, to put into relief these two political movements and a young impressionable person caught in those two situations? So what was that, how was that crucial to your story, and why are you more worried now than you were about that?
Shall I for the sake of our audience, should I describe this story in a nutshell?
Yes, you could do that.
Okay. So it's a story about Joy and Rohini Sengupta. They are a couple in Kolkata. Joy works as a branch manager for a bank, could be ICICI or HDFC or what have you. And Rohini is the principal of a DPS, of a school. They're in their early 40s. Now, they were both sort of radical progressives in university days. Okay, acted in plays. They strummed the guitar and sang Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. And their lifestyle is sort of the classic liberal secular lifestyle. I mean, they would go to watch a play by Girish Karnad. They would come to Kolkata Literary Meet. They would have strong views about caste discrimination or gender discrimination or religious discrimination. Okay? They're progressives. Now, they have one son, their only child, Vivek, who they call Bobby. Now, Bobby is a first-year computer science student in a new private university in a neighboring state. I haven't named that state. It could be Jharkhand, it could be Bihar, okay? Then one day, when Joy is taking a cigarette break at work, he gets a phone call. And the phone call is from one of his ex-comrades from 20 years ago in university, Mimi. And Mimi says, "Don't you recognize me?" And he says, "Of course." And Mimi says, "We should get together." And Joy, when you meet old friends, he said, "Of course, we should do a reunion. We should all get together. We should have a party." He says, "No, no, no. I mean, we should meet today, this evening." He said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah. Let's meet this evening. You can make some excuses, but I'm happy to meet you wherever you would want to meet with me." So what's the urgency? I mean, he's puzzled by the urgency. And they decide to meet at Flurry's on Park Street, which is not far from here. And after the first round of chit-chat, Joy discovers that Mimi, who was a radical in university years, has now become an university administrator in the same university that their son Bobby attends, the same university their son Bobby attends. Okay? And then I will read a small little bit, if I may, which will tell you what happens in this very surprising and unusual meeting. So when Joy finds out that Mimi is an university administrator, he pulls her leg. He says, "So you've quit, become an activist, become a despot, whipping students into shape. What activism are you talking about?" Mimi retorted, "Do you have any idea what's happening in college campuses all over India? It's nothing short of war." You mean like the wars we used to fight? Boycotting exams, calling strikes, barricading, picketing, shouting slogans. Dropping her knife onto her plate, Mimi gave Joy a long stare. "You really don't know, do you? Our thing was child's play, a storm in a teacup. All that's finished. Now you have the real deal. You've heard of the nationalist students, have you?" Joy nodded with an eye on the little girl at the next table who was badgering her mother for ice cream. "Those that want to cleanse the nation of impurities." He recited lines read in the papers, making the sign of double quotes in the air. Exactly. They want to create a Hindu homeland in India. They're talking about a golden age. Muslims are outsiders. Christians too. Only they are the true inheritors of the soil, its divine children. But that's just saying. Joy stifled a yawn, like we used to demand a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's more than words. These students are hell-bent on stopping meat from entering the campus. They want a curfew at the women's hostel. They're harassing liberal-minded professors, targeting Muslims, storming plays, banning couples from dating on Valentine's Day, demanding that the university rewrite the textbooks. The nationalists are creating havoc. You know about Altaf, don't you? Mimi gazed unblinkingly at him. Who? The poor Muslim boy who was abducted from his college room in our university? He and his friends opposed the nationalists. Maybe there's some arguments between the two sides. He was kidnapped and taken away. No one knows where he is. Joy nodded. He had watched it on the news. The mention of Manhar and Bobby's university had caught his eye. It has been 3 months now. There's no trace of him. Altaf's mother, Ruxana, has come from her village to look for her son. The poor woman has been going around pleading to everyone, the university administration, the police, the government, but no one's come forward to help her. Do you think he might still be alive? Joy tapped the empty espresso cup on the table, drawing Gomez's attention. Can I have one more of those too? Mimi spoke under her breath. Her face seemed more strained than when she'd arrived at Fleury's. Fidgeting with her spoon, she resumed. That's the question no one has an answer to. Is he being held captive in a secret hideout? Are they torturing him? Have they finished him off already? But someone must know, right? He can't simply disappear into thin air. Taking a sip of her espresso, Mimi leant forward on her chair. You can help to find Altaf. Let his mother know what's happened to him. Me? Joy's exclamation drew attention to their table. A senior journalist holding court among his juniors gave him an inquisitive look. Busy with other patrons, Gomez struck out his hand to indicate he'd be free soon to attend to Mr. Sengupta and his guest. This is why I've come all the way from Manhar to plead with you, to meet you face to face, rather than speak on the phone. You can help Altaf and his mother. I wish to meet you urgently before it's too late to save him. Setting down his cup, Joy collected himself before speaking. How can I help, Mimi? I'm a banker. We don't know about these things. We deal with money, with savings and loans, not kidnapping. If the police won't help, how can I? You know someone who knows. You can persuade him to reveal the truth. Mimi's voice took on greater urgency. Your son, Bobby, can tell us everything that has happened to Altaf. So, Mimi tells Joy that his son, Bobby, has become a leader of the nationalists and is implicated in Altaf's disappearance. And this comes as a shock to him. It comes as a shock to him and to Rohini later on in the story. Our son? I mean, as you were saying, Raghu, I mean, we are the classic liberals. Our son has become a Hindu nationalist? And even more than that, he could be implicated in the disappearance and maybe the death of a young student. So he could be a criminal. And this shock propels the story. And so the parents embark on a journey to find out the truth about Bobby, the truth about Altaf, and the truth about India. Now, to briefly return to your question, I grew up in the 70s in Kolkata, when we had another kind of extreme idealism being played out. In our college hostels at night, these wily political recruiters from the extreme left, the Naxals, would come. They would bring in the Red Book. They would bring in bomb-making manuals. They would recruit young men, young boys and girls who wanted to do good to society, who had an ideal about this society, but it was an extreme form of idealism. And that extreme idealism had, in my mind, very similar kinds of impact that we are seeing today. They're having impact at the political level, at the psychological level within families, and also tearing apart the very delicate balance of this society that we know as India.
So is that why you called it in an ideal world?
Yeah, I mean, I am very suspicious of the ideal world. You know, when people say, oh, in an ideal world, as if the ideal world is all good. The ideal world is a place, in my view, where everything works perfectly according to a particular perspective of life. And those who buy into it are citizens of this ideal world. Those who do not buy into it are demonized, are ostracized, and are punished. So I'm very worried and I'm very anxious that we never achieve the ideal state, no matter what the ideal might be.
Now, anyone who follows the news will recognize that Kunal's writing over a real-world analog, which is the story of Najib Ahmed, who disappeared from a student at JNU who disappeared 5 years ago, the day after he was seen having a scuffle with some students of a right-wing group. And that was 5 years ago in October, and it was a national story when it happened, and of course was long forgotten and barely registered on anyone when that 5-year point arrived, and Najib has not appeared, and the police who never, the Delhi police who never undertook a proper investigation have gotten away with, with another situation like this and allowing it to be buried. So I wanted to say first of all, Kunal, I want to recognize that you've done an important service by keeping the story of this real person alive through your art. It is it's nothing as blunt as a polemic about a real life event, but your novel does refer and keep the memory of this actual person and this actual struggle alive. So I much respect for that. What's interesting though is that in the real life event, the name of Najib Ahmed sort of echoed for a while through the news, and we learned very little about his accused assailants or abductors. We learned their political identity, and we learned that they were, the accused were in the ABVP, etc. But they were never even taken into police custody, so they slipped well under the radar. What you've decided to do is, although you do explore Altaf's world and who he was, the real protagonist or antagonist, the real central character of your inquiry is the other person, is the accused assailant, is the nationalist, in his own terms, the nationalist warrior who's doing what's necessary.
He disapproves of his own mother's lifestyle in a way.
And that is a fascinating inquiry. It's not something I spend much time thinking about. I don't spend much time thinking about how a young right-wing... I'm trying to find the right words for it. How a young, violent right-wing activist sees themselves, how to define them in their own terms. And that's something that you've taken the trouble to do while never offering your approval to that transformation. Do you want to tell us about about the effort to see Bobby's transformation in his own eyes?
Before you answer, I want to throw that question back at you, that you don't know of such people. And earlier in the conversation, you did mention that people write to you saying that their parents are being muddied by the exertions of Times Now and Republic every evening. So is it that you only know of a certain kind of people who reach out to you, and those people who exist like Vivek, Aka, Bobby, don't really? So are we really living in silos in that sense? There is no conversation actually. Those youngsters will not reach out to you, and these youngsters will never reach out to a Dadichi, who is the main antagonist in a way in this book. I mean, he is the main antagonist. So do you think we are all actually prisoners in our own silos who are unable to see? So you're fascinated by the portrayal of Bobby as somebody who's turned right-wing from a very liberal background.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to paint it in completely relativistic terms as though we're all equally complicit in failing to understand each other, and we should all, and it's only a question of opening our minds to each other, because some of these are violent ideologies. They involve the wish to be violent on fellow citizens, and we see that playing out and building up every single day. That said, yeah, there's obviously no question that we exist in silos, and in my experience, the silos are generally of a larger social class. So in fact, I have very few friends, and it takes quite an effort to reach anyone who is a supporter of Hindu nationalism. There are very, very few of those in my social circle, for instance. What the novel does to kind of blow that open is that it places the ideological enemy right in your lap. Like, now it's your child, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's psychologically convenient to believe that the enemy is outside, or those you disagree with are outside of your pale, and that we live in our own echo chamber, and we all share each other's values, okay? Now, I was recently at JLF, and there were many, many sessions on democracy and freedom and treason and things like that. it was interesting to see there was actually very little debate going on at these sessions or afterwards. And they were all echo chambers when we were speaking to those who believed or shared our values and shared our views. And there were speakers and there were scholars who came from the right wing of the Hindutva pale, but it was minuscule. But they were minuscule in number. Okay? One of the things that excited me when I was trying to write this, and I'm glad you brought up Najib Ahmed, my starting point was not Najib Ahmed, but I then went into Najib's story because that was the flow of my narrative. My starting point was, how are people radicalized? How do people become radicalized? And one of the contributing factors, certainly not the only one, is the kind of education system, the kind of education setup that we are creating for young people, particularly those who want to study the engineering and the sciences. Okay? Many of these private universities are outside of population centers. Outside of population centers. Okay? These are kids who have gone through their intensive BYJU'S experience. The intensive BYJU'S experience, and they have ticked all the right boxes. And they can solve mathematical problems. Okay? And so their mind is tuned into, if there's a problem, there will be a solution. If there's a problem, there will be a solution. Now, society is very complex. And the problems that we see manifested all around us do not have simple solutions. Okay? And so in those environments, there are clean slates of young people to be filled in, to be written in by recruiters. And I've seen this during the Naxalbari movement. Okay? Most of the recruits of the Naxals in Bengal in the 1970s were science and engineering students. Okay? And therefore, I see a pattern here which is sadly replicating itself, although from an opposite ideological spectrum. That young people who, I haven't painted Bobby or Vivek as a villain. I don't consider him to be a demon. He's a victim. He's a victim of an extreme radical ideology. Okay? And his parents had lost touch with him. You see, the parents' classical liberal upbringing is that we don't want to influence our children. We should let our children grow up by themselves, decide what they want to believe, what they want to do. So in not trying to influence or mentor or shape the minds of their children, they've left the space open for others to shape their minds. And the others in this environment, the political recruiters, are from the extremes. And my big worry, going even beyond the book, which is why I do want you to engage with the book, and if you, as you said, Mala, if you disagree, disagree. Okay? But engage, because we, as citizens of India, have actually left the two extremes to fight out the battles with each other and bias our conversations and drag us into different directions. Okay? So the battle is really being fought between the extreme end of the liberal view, which I don't certainly ascribe to, and the extreme end of the so-called religiosity view, which I don't ascribe to. And we, the middle, the center of Indian society, have given up the mantle. We have given up the mantle. We are not willing to engage and say, hey, look, no matter, I agree with you, Raghu, it is not a question of equal sharing of blame, but here is the problem. In a country of 1.3 billion people, if you take out the infants, about 1 billion people, even if you go by electoral numbers, and one shouldn't simply go by electoral numbers, if you disagree with half the population, what are you going to do with them? Drop 500 million into the Arabian Sea? Drop 500 million into the Bay of Bengal? That you will engage in vitriolic bashing of each other? Okay? That you will engage in very refined arguments? You know, it saddens me, it pains me to say, in my other life I'm an academic, but it saddens me to say that we have reached the end of arguments. We have reached the end of arguments. There's nothing I can say that will convince somebody who believes in Hindutva that they should be pluralistic. And nothing that they can say to me that will make me believe that this is a nation where the Hindus have predominance and everything else, everybody else must play second-class citizens. We have reached the end of arguments. And therefore, what we are facing is a dire situation. We have the memory of the partition project from 1947 that has been kept alive in this country, has been resurrected in this country. And it's not enough. It is not enough to hurl invectives at each other anymore. It's not enough to sit on the dais of a literary festival and say, hey, look, my view is the right view, and I can articulate that in a wonderful way and convince all of you. It's not enough. Whether we like it or not, we have to find some kind of a common ground. And I don't know, Mala, what that common ground is. I don't know, Raghu, what that common ground is. I'm as clueless about that as anybody else. But the unity of Indians, the integrity of this nation cannot be sacrificed. And we know that politicians will play us one way or the other. We know that media is going to play us one way or the other. But we have to rise above the politicians. We have to rise above the media. And in many ways, that's the place from where I was writing a detective novel. In many ways, it's a detective novel. So,
okay, I'm just going to stop you there. And about this plot, I just wanted to ask you one place I think all of us would identify with, and where he said that, the conversation is broken down. Are you on a school WhatsApp group? Yeah. So these are now small battlegrounds, because a lot of the people who've left the country, I'm not generalizing, tend to actually take a very pro-nationalistic view. So have you ever left a group?
Well, I mean, I try to leave WhatsApp groups as a matter of policy.
Yeah.
But there are building society groups that is, those are notorious. Yeah. And
so is just leaving the group a kind of an option? I'll give you a small story before you answer
please.
that. I run a handloom store. So yes, the polity is completely divided. There's intolerance. We see wild, angry debates in parliament. So I was at my store and about 12 people walked in. They were in very, very trademark politician clothes. And they'd come to buy Bengal saris, handlooms. And they were from across the entire political spectrum. They were friendly. The BJP gentleman's wife was WhatsApping, calling the Congress lady who was choosing the saris. They were friendly. You could make out there was conversation. That the wife who is in Delhi knew the lady who was in Calcutta. It was all just like colleagues in some corporate, what are they called, these retreats, go shopping, and it was as amicable, amiable, and happy as that. And just looking at them there, I thought of my WhatsApp groups, my Facebook friends, who are fighting wild battles on behalf of these people who are buying saris for each other, which is a very important decision. So to choose a sari for another party person's wife, it is an important decision in any case. So I was, sometimes do we take all this too seriously and take our presence in a WhatsApp group or a Facebook page or, of course, on Twitter too seriously, sort of trying to change that one person who might slowly become a little more tolerant?
Well, first of all, I want to echo what both of you said, including your anecdote. I think that's something that we don't spend enough time dwelling on is how do parliamentarians actually relate to each other. Now, every session, whenever there's a parliament session in Delhi, people tend to have, MPs have parties at their houses because they have great parties for having houses, and the winter session is the best time. So typically in January, some MP or the others hosting a party every night during the session. And if you're a journalist like me, sometimes you slip in there on some pretext or the other, and it's the most amazing sight. Like you said, across party boundaries, they know how to be collegial, how to be warm to each other, and essentially how not to recognize that they are ideological, how not to, they don't see each other as ideological adversaries in personal terms. They are essentially like professional colleagues. You're right, and it's wild because then you realize that you are the one who is fighting this fight with their cadre, and you know. But I don't think that what that demonstrates is that the fight is pointless or is just a delusion.
No, what it does demonstrate is that there are people on both sides, and people can change, and people can see the light. If we just completely, is that what you're trying to say in your novel? Why am I answering for you? You know, seeing each other as people, is that something your novel would, in a way, I mean, we've talked about the anguish at the start. Let's talk about, I mean, the end is very open-ended. I'm not giving it out. It's not...
Let me just complete my thought.
Yeah.
I have never actually thought about what these parliament parties represent, but they do represent one thing, which is the parliamentary ideal is that there should be a diversity of people representing a diversity of constituencies and ideas, and that they should all be able to converse and debate and not hate each other. And to an extent, that ideal does persist in India, even you know, at a lawn party in Praful Patel's house, for instance. And maybe there is something from that that we need to learn, which is that the way that the divisions are amplified for our consumption to turn us into infuriated kind of culture warriors is a problem. And it happens more at whatever, you know, the peripheries where we are than actually is actually happening at the center. But I think we need to come back to the book because I think that the best... I'm so interested in the way that Kunal has grappled with, while obviously I assume not being a Hindu right-winger in any way yourself, you have actually painted a surprisingly sympathetic portrait of Bobby's transformation. And if anything, if I wanted to have a random ideological brawl with you, I would say that you may have erred on the side of sympathy there because you've shown, you've linked his ideological radicalization with a certain inner transformation that is an honorable one. That's something that he gains purpose, he gains something that he needs, which is an energizing vision of something to belong to. And in fact, he becomes a kind of saffron Adonis by the end of it. But in his own gaze, or in the gaze of the people around him. So you've given him that. You've given him not just irrational reasons for what he's doing, but actually some rational developmental reasons.
You can take that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, after I'd written this book, and our daughter, who's a historian, read the manuscript, she said, "Baba, you're not going to please anyone with this book. Because the liberals will say you've not been tough enough, and the nationalists will say you've been mean." Okay? But why did I do that? The purpose of the novel is not, again, to engage in another round of diatribes. The purpose is to understand. In trying to understand, we don't sympathize with the cause of this person. But in trying to understand, we try to unravel what really happened. What really happened to this young man? Okay? It would have been dead easy for me to paint these characters in black and white terms. I could have said that Bobby is a monster. This is what he wants to do. He wants to, engage in violent behavior prompted by his ideological guru, Dadhichi. Okay? And that would have sort of, in many ways, set up this binary very clearly. But what I wanted to do is get away from the binary. And that's sort of trying to respond to what you were saying, Mala, is it's not enough for us anymore to say, this is the way it is. We know the way it is. I didn't have to write a novel to say, this is the way it is in our country. Okay? But through the narrative to imply what might lie in the future. You see, despite what Bobby might have done or might not have done, and I don't want to give the ending away, the parents cannot forsake their son. Joy and Rohini cannot say that, you're no longer a son anymore. Go away. Neither can Bobby forsake his parents. So they have to live with each other, and they have to find a place of accommodation which is psychologically and politically acceptable to both. Okay? And I don't know how that's going to happen.
I think, I just want to say that I think that maybe some of the best passages that you have in the book are of Bobby's kind of contained, frustrated, angry tolerance of his parents. He comes home and he's now essentially a young saffron, like self-described saffron warrior, but his parents are good old liberal Calcutta Bhadraloks, and he has to endure them the way we all endure our parents, except in this case it's this different perspective from which we don't hopefully have to deal with that. And some of the best lines in the book also, one that jumped out of me, is when Rohini, the mother, is at the end of a long evening speaking to her husband. She says, she tells him about their son. I want him to be the way he was when he was a baby, when I wasn't afraid of him. And this recognition that you can be afraid of your child, and because of how you relate to their ideology and what their ideology is very, very profound and very touching. I think that essentially what you've been saying raises a very good question, which is, how can, what this book tries to do raises a good question, which is, how do we look at a world in which hate is a real problem without being people who hate? And how do we look at a world in which intolerance is spreading without us taking on those habits of intolerance?
Taking a strong stand yourself. So he mentioned that passage about, she's almost lost her child. So in a way, it's also two mothers who've lost their sons. So we don't hear much about Altaf's mother, but it's again a search. Both mothers are actually looking for the sons they've lost.
Yeah. I mean, there is a kind of circularity in this narrative where obviously Rohini, by the way, a lot of people, readers have told me that they find Rohini to be more attractive than Joy. Okay.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's probably because women are more attractive than men in their psychology.
I was just going to say that, but then women are more attractive.
Yeah, they are. And it's more exciting for an author to write a woman's character than a man's character. And I'm generalizing grossly. But Rohini is on a search with Joy, as is Rukhsana, the poor weaving mother whose first generation son, Altaf, has gone to university. Father was an auto rickshaw driver who died in a car accident. And he's gone to the university, and he's the light of her life. Okay? And now he's gone missing. And she's going from pillar to post to find them. Okay? But then the moment of realization also appears for Rukhsana. And again, I'm not going to give the ending away, when she sees her tragedy in light of a broader tragedy. Just as Rohini, Bobby's mother, sees the tragedy of what's happened to her son in light of a broader tragedy, so does Rukhsana. And in there, the two women actually carry the crux of this whole thing forward. And therein, perhaps therein lies hope. Perhaps in the two mothers lies hope.
One more question. So, In an Ideal World was written right through the pandemic. And as you said, there were the farmer protests, there was CAA, Shaheen Bagh just before the pandemic hit. So did the pandemic in any way make the book a little darker?
I think we were all in a dark mood, but the pandemic was less problematic to me as an author because we live in self-imposed quarantines anyway. Okay? So I'm forever at my desk, and I hardly go out unless I'm forced to do so. But yes, it was very troubling. I think the darkness came from a bigger disappointment. the disappointment was that when we were growing up in university, there was this romantic notion that tomorrow will be better than today. Okay? Not simply in terms of the society, but also in terms of the maturing of the human consciousness, maturing of our spirits inside, that we would somehow become more compassionate. And maybe you can say this is romantic, but that we would become more romantic, more caring for others. And at this stage of my life, having gone through that circle, I find the same intolerance back in society with a vengeance, and some would say, in a greater intensity. That was the darkness from where this novel came about.
Would you say it's it's an intensity that informs this wave of political unrest in colleges and universities, and across social media, which didn't exist back then?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what you just said is gets to the heart of what we're all feeling, which is that we have been accustomed, especially maybe over the preceding 20 years, to feeling that possibly a little bit of this was like neoliberal claptrap that we grew up in, but that the world was becoming a milder, more compassionate, better organized, and less tribalistic place, and that India was as well. India seemed to have figured some things out that we set out to figure out 75 years ago, and were struggling to keep learning. That's certainly how it felt as a journalist. I often wonder whether young people today realize that for people my age, I'm in my late 30s, when I was in my 20s, we actually lived in a country where it felt like we had made a great deal of progress towards some kind of liberal milieu. But the fact is that now the country is grappling with an increasingly popular ideology that might, that if it reaches its logical conclusion, might mean its logical conclusion is the logic of partition. It is the logic of civil war. Yeah. And that is an inescapably terrifying feeling that college students understand well, because politics and because they are alert and
it is one of the battlegrounds in many ways, where student politics is where actually there is conflict in a way that we don't see in other forms of politics.
Right. Yeah.
So I think this is a good time. I see a very young audience, which is encouraging after my last comment. So questions. Okay, there's one lady at the back. The mic is closer to her, and the other lady with the mic can please come forward.
So you all both spoke about how when you all were growing up, you all had a more liberal society, or your colleagues were more liberal. And you talked about how your doctor friends made a pact to not talk about politics. And I wonder that in their younger years, they also shared a liberal ideology. And now you see that all these people who previously shared this liberal ideology is shifting to a slightly righter side. And I understand that there is media brainwashing, or what the media is portraying, but these are all educated people whose life opportunities are not going to change in the coming years. So what would you say are the other reasons that they are shifting from their previously held liberal ideology to a more righter side?
I live in Britain, and I see this also in Britain. It's not simply in this country. It's a phenomenon that is happening around the world. I think you asked about what are the factors. I think there's a very complex set of factors. A sense of victimhood is being inculcated in people. That no matter how well off you are in society, you might be very well educated, you may have a great job or a great profession, but somebody is whispering inside your head saying, hey, you are a victim. You're in your own nation, you're now going to become a minority. Okay? The playbook of the 1930s of Germany is being played out, not simply in this country, but for example in America, which is a country that I sort of grew up in and I can't recognize anymore. when large number of white Americans are being, who are some of them are very well educated, well established in life, are being spoken to in the very seductive words of politicians and media and various social formations, which is saying, look, you are the victim, okay? And guess who are the who are the enemy? The immigrants are the enemy, okay? So again, I don't think I can provide a very quick answer to your question, but that's what I was trying to imply, that there were complex social forces at play that are able to overcome the barriers created by liberal education in the first place and transform many people into taking a far more defensive stance with respect to their own identities.
The lady in front.
Hi. Firstly, I haven't read your book yet, and I would love to. My question basically is, do you think the death of the neoliberal dream actually lies in the fact that even today we refuse to deconstruct our privilege? Because in this entire conversation, at no point did I hear the word privilege. And one of the things that I think is leading us to this world of right-wing propagandist thing is not agreeing to the fact that we are born in privilege, that there are certain things which we get, right? And yeah, so would love to hear.
You're absolutely right. There is a party scene in this book. If you do end up reading this novel, there's a party scene. And in that party scene, you will see privilege, liberal privilege being played out in all its glory, okay? So many of us have also started thinking that the liberal project is complete. The liberal project is complete because we have been liberated and we have a privileged lifestyle that allows us to be liberated. But that's not the case with the vast majority of Indians, as you're implying. And because the vast majority of Indians still have to deal with roti, kapra and makan, the liberal dream is still ways off and far off. And this is a fact that is seized on by demagogues all over the world, saying that look at those liberals. They are all well trained, they study in foreign universities. When in Delhi, you will find them at the India International Center drinking very good Darjeeling tea. And they feel that they rule this nation, whereas the poor and those who are not privileged, they don't care about this liberal dream. Okay? So you're absolutely right. The position of privilege or the flaunting of privilege or not acknowledging that those who are in the liberal fold, many of them, not all of them, but are largely privileged people in this society, has led to a kind of a backlash. And that backlash has happened not just in India, but in all over the world.
I think we are out of time. Our next panel is gazing very patiently through the window. I'm sure there are more questions, and Kunal will be happy to take them on the sidelines there, and he's also happy to sign copies of his books. He's sitting right here. Thank you, Kunal. Thank you for a book that leaves us with more questions than answers. I think, Raghu, you would agree with that. And asks the reader to also look at their own life. Someone once told me that, a person from a high caste never talks about caste. So I guess you didn't hear privilege because we are also guilty of the same omission. So thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Kunal. And do read this book. I have read many of Kunal's books, but this is very special, if I may say so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Mala, for indulging me.
I'd like to invite the next panel onto the stage. I'm sorry we're running late. Shaunchari, if you could just do the honors.